Good morning, welcome back. Today is April 18th. It's good to have you here out on the still not quite yet flower bestrewn deck. Now I thought that this day would be warmer than last, but apparently the weather has not been cooperating with us. But we're here again today to talk about what happened on this date in April 18th and then get on to our study in the book of Ephesians. It was on this date in 1506 that the cornerstone was laid for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. This is the major church building in Rome. And the Pope who authorized this building was a Pope named Pope Julius II, whose nickname was the Warrior Pope, for a number of reasons having to do with battles that the Catholic Church was involved in. This was something they did a lot back then. But he did several other things, including he was the one who began what we call the Catholicizing of Central and South America. So one of the reasons why Central America and South America and the Philippines and others areas are predominantly Catholic today is because of the work of Julius II, Pope Julius II, in the early 16th century. He also is the one that commissioned the painting of the Sistine Chapel. If you've ever been to Rome, you've gone in and seen the Sistine Chapel that was done because of him, Michelangelo, and all that. Now, in order to pay for this cornerstone, and I'm not the cornerstone, but actually to pay for the building of St. Peter's Basilica, Julius II seized on a technique that was already in existence, but he really ramped up the use of what was called indulgences. And this was the idea that a person could pay money to the church in order to obtain time off in purgatory for friends, relatives, people they cared about. So now Pope Julius died in 1510, and he was replaced by the next Pope, Leo X, who incidentally was a member of the Medici family. Back then, there was a lot, getting to be the Pope was a lot more political than it is today. And by political, I mean secular political. I'm not Catholic, so I'm sure there's a lot of politics, strictly speaking, involved. But I think in terms of, secular politics, it was a lot more common back then. But Leo X continued this process of using indulgences to finance the building of St. Peter's Basilica, so much so that he sent a guy named Herzl to a town called Wittenberg, where he ran into a young monk named Martin Luther. As a result, as you know, on October 31st, 1517, 95 Theses about indulgences. Next thing you know, you've got the Protestant Reformation. So begun largely due to the building of St. Peter's Basilica. Now that's significant because it was on this date in 1521 that Martin Luther appeared at what was called the Diet of Worms. Or if you're looking at it in English, the Diet of Worms, but the Diet of Worms in 1521. In fact, this is the day they believe that Luther is alleged to have said, here I stand, I can do no other, God help me. There's some question about whether he actually said that or not, and all of that. But it was on this date that if he said it, it was on this date in 1521. In 1688, the Germantown Quaker Petition Against Slavery was published. This is the first formal written protest against slavery in the colonies, done by a group of Quakers from Pennsylvania on this date in 1688. And of course, it was on this date, and if you listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere, that happened on this night in 1775. This is the story of the one if by land, two if by sea, and all that. So that took place in 1775. It's much later that the poem was written. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake occurred. The San Francisco earthquake that ended up killing approximately 4,000 people occurred on this date. Now, the San Francisco earthquake is kind of to the history of San Francisco what the Chicago fire is to the history of Chicago. Being somebody from the Chicago area, of course, you kind of understand that differentiation. But that happened on this date in 1906. Also, in 1906, although not also in California, but a little further south, the LA Times first reported on what was referred to as the Azusa Street Revival. First did this, and as a result, their newspaper article gave publication, and next thing you know, Many look at this Azusa Street revival as launching the Pentecostal movement in the United States. Now, this was kind of just a watershed moment. It was started by a guy named William Seymour, an African-American preacher named William Seymour, who began preaching earlier that year, 1906 that is, and was having some success and seeing the Lord move. And so they moved into a building on Azusa Street. And there they held their meetings from 1906 all the way to 1915. Okay, so it continued on until 1915. But again, many people look to that as the beginning point of the Pentecostal or the charismatic movement in the United States. Pay no attention to the barking dogs in the background. They're just happy to be here. In 1964, left-handed pitcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers, Sandy Koufax, was the first pitcher to strike out the side on 9 pitches. Being a lifelong baseball fan, you understand how significant that is. But it's been done since, but he was the first to do it in 1964. Today is Clarence Darrow's birthday, famous American lawyer, agnostic, actually more of an atheist, was born on this date in 1857. He died in 1938, and I believe it was on his death day that, as he was dying, he had promised that if there is an afterlife, he would appear at a certain point in Chicago's Hyde Park on his death date in 1938. And I believe that there are still people that gather at this particular bridge where he said he was going to appear every year on his death date. To the best of my knowledge, he hasn't appeared. John Fox died on this date in 1587. John Fox, best known as being the author of the book Fox's Book of Martyrs. This is one of those books that many of us are familiar with, although few have actually read. And finally, it was on this date in 1955 that Albert Einstein died. Albert Einstein, the great physicist, scientist, died on this date in 1955, which is kind of surprising. I thought he was still around considering the number of memes and statements and things that you see about Albert Einstein on the internet. But be that as it may, having finished with this, let's get back to talking about Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to get back into that and continue on into Ephesians chapter 5 today. Welcome back. We're talking about Ephesians again, Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus. Now let me take a step back here and just kind of remind everybody what the big picture of the book is. And again, anytime you're going through a book, it's always a good idea to kind of periodically take a step back, remember what the whole focus of the book is. Paul spent a lot of time in Ephesus, a couple of years. He had a lot of investment, a lot of time invested in that particular ministry. He knew the leaders, he knew the people there, and so certainly he cared about what was going on. So that's the first thing to remember. Second thing is Paul had a lot of experience in ministry. He had seen how the gospel played out. He had seen how churches developed, how these communities got together, and what were typical things that happened. He had seen kind of some of the ramifications of the gospel coming out of this Jewish milieu and into this third new way, this not Gentile, not Judaism, but this new way, this Christian way. He had seen how this played out, and he saw what some of the ramifications were. And so for the book of Ephesians, we don't believe that Paul is really dealing with specific issues per se. It's not that especially when we get in today's session and we talk about some of the things he says don't do, it's not that there are people, now there may be, again, we don't have perfect knowledge here, but we don't really believe that Paul said, okay, there's a guy that's doing this, and I have to say something, there's a guy that's doing this, a guy that's doing this. I mean, that's what Corinthians is for, okay? But here, it's just, Paul is kind of going back in his experience, and he's saying, okay, these are the things you want to be aware of, okay? It's kind of like, there was a guy one time that called me about 9 o'clock at night, and he said, Stan, I'm 40 years old, and I have never purchased a car from a dealership, and I'm going in there tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. What do I need to know? And I proceeded to spend like the next 2.5 hours because, again, I spent 30 years working for a major auto manufacturer. So these are all the things you need to know. And so Paul is like, okay, these are like all of the things you need to know. This is kind of all of the issues that are going to come up and all the reminders. And the book itself, the book of Ephesians, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, is divided into two main parts. The first part is more not philosophical, more theological. Here's, here's what God has done for us. Here's what your position in Christ means. Here's what we have to be thankful for. And then the last part are sort of the applications. So that because of this, then this. Okay, these are that good theology leads to good actions. Okay, and so now Paul has we talked a lot about the theology and our position in Christ and in the heavenlies and all of that. And now we're into chapters 4 through 6, where Paul is giving these instructions to the people at Ephesus. These things to remember, these kind of concrete examples of stuff to do or stuff not to do. Okay, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the most part today. Actually, today is a pretty simple session because, again, it's interesting that Snodgrass, Klein Snodgrass, who wrote one of the commentaries I'm using, talks about this particular passage in his commentary, and he says this. He says, to bring the practical instructions offered here into our day requires no bridging in themselves. Rather, they require obedience. Okay? So, not a lot of real deep thoughts, not a lot of deep Greek exegesis is necessary. It's all pretty straightforward here, especially for today. Now, next week, it'll get a little trickier. But this week, it's all pretty cut and dry. So, let's start today. We're going to begin in verse 25, chapter 4, beginning with verse 25. That, however, is not the way of... verse 25. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. Anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Looking at this passage, there's a series of, I'm going to call them commands, and they're and each of these commands comes with a contrasting. So there's, for example, I'll give the model here right at the start, which says, anyone, let's see, put off falsehood, speak truth. Okay, so don't do this, do this. And then there's also, for many of them, there's kind of a motivation. So here's why you want to do this. Okay, so where did I go here? Put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbors, for we are all members of one body. Okay, so that's your motivation. Okay, so there's this part of the do this, don't do this, here's why kind of thing. So that's many of the ones that are coming up over this passage are going to have that kind of format as Paul is looking. And again, Paul is just thinking, okay, these are things that a new church, a growing church needs to remember. Okay, and so here we go. We're going to just start in on those. Okay, so verse 25, therefore each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. Now, this is the second time Paul has talked about putting off something. Earlier in verse 22, he said, you were taught with your regard to your former way of life to put off your old self. Okay, so just put it off, and this image of like removing a coat, this kind of put it off, kind of put off falsehood. Just stop doing it and speak truthfully to your neighbor. Why? For we are all members of one body. Again, this is that mystery of unity. Paul is saying, you're not Jews, you're not Gentiles anymore, you're Christians. Okay, you are followers of the way. You are followers. You are Jesus people. You are followers of Jesus. Okay, you are this new way. Okay, and so we don't want the negative vestiges of this particular people group or this particular people group. We want this people group, this united people group, to be different. And here's the things you need to remember not to do. Okay, so therefore, put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. So again, and this is always a tricky thing. So does this mean that we have to say everything we believe? No. Okay. No. I mean, speak truthfully. If somebody asks what your opinion of something is, and it's a situation where and they're clearly asking your opinion, okay, then you should speak truthfully. Or if you know something that's right, know something is wrong, then you should speak truthfully along this matter. Okay. Now, if they're asking your opinion of something, okay, your opinion is just that. It's just your opinion. This is how I feel. It's no big deal. So again, and obviously we don't want to be lying. We don't want to say something. And again, there's a, in today's society, especially in today's political world, we have this fixation on lying, and we've really, what's the word? How do I want to put this? We really need to focus on what we mean when somebody lies. Okay. Now, in today's political climate, if person A made a speech in favor of something, okay, and 20 years later, so person A is a candidate or a politician or something, and person A made a speech and said, this is what this is. And then in 20 years later, when he or she is running for another election, we say person A says something different. Okay. And then we immediately leap to the idea of that person is lying. Okay. That's not necessarily the case. Okay. So again, that's the only thing that, just because somebody says, and again, if somebody tells me, if somebody tells me something and I have no reason to doubt that they said that, and I repeat to you what it is that person told me. So say, for example, did you go to the store? Somebody, I say to this person, did you go to the store? And the person says to me, yes, I went to the store. And so then I go to the next person and I say, yes, so-and-so went to the store. Okay. Well, it turns out that so-and-so didn't go to the store, that he or she just didn't want to tell me that. So he or she lied to me. They knowingly told me something that wasn't true. They told it to me. I don't know that it's not true. So I said to someone else, yeah, so-and-so went to the store. Okay. Now, I'm saying something at that moment that is not true. Okay. Because so-and-so didn't go to the store. Okay. But I don't know that. I'm not intentionally trying to deceive you. I am just passing along the information I have. Okay. But in our political climate today, we go, oh, that person lied. Okay. So really, again, it's just very common that because politicians and people in public change their mind a lot, and things, there are things that I said 10 years ago, there are things that I said 20 years ago that I don't agree with today that I may have changed my mind on. Okay. So that doesn't mean I'm lying when I say something different. It just means I've changed my mind. Okay. So again, we want to speak truthfully with our neighbors because again, we're all members of the body. Okay. And it comes down to, I remember I took a philosophy class one time, and we were talking about lying from a philosophical point of view. Okay. What is it about lying that makes it bad? Okay. And from the philosophical point of view, the thing about lying is that when you lie to someone, why do you lie to somebody? Why do you not speak truthfully? Well, it's because you don't believe or you don't trust that person to handle the truth. Okay. I mean, I know we're all thinking of Jack Nicholson on the court in that movie. You can't handle the truth. But if you really think about it, that's really what it comes down to. Why do I lie to you? Because I don't want you to know the truth because of how you're going to respond to it. And I want to use you. I want to manage your emotions. I want to manage your reactions. And so I'm going to tell you something that's going to keep your reaction the way I, so you see what you're doing when you're lying to somebody, you're using them. Okay. You're not respecting their individualism. You're just telling them. Okay. So, this, we don't want to do that because again, we're members of one body. Okay. So I could go on. I'm going to get back into talking about the text. Verse 26, in your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. So there you go. Don't be angry because you're giving the devil a foothold. Okay. So it'll keep the devil from having a foothold. Okay, so there's your prohibition or your condemnation, so to speak, and then your motivation. Okay. Now, this is an interesting passage. It's used often, don't let, so there's all these marriage conferences that say, okay, don't, never go to bed angry or don't be angry. Okay. So again, what Paul is talking here, he's not prohibiting anger, because in other passages they talk about anger, and God, of course, is mentioned as being angry at times in the Old Testament. So is Paul saying, okay, you can never be angry about anything, so you have to just be, everything has to, you have to treat everything calmly and collectively? Well, that would be great. That's nice work if you can get it, but most of us can't be that passive about things. And I don't think that's what Paul is talking about here. He's talking about, don't let your anger lead to sin. Okay? In other words, kind of be able to control, work on controlling what anger you have, and so that you don't do anything stupid. Okay? It was really, and you don't sin. Okay? In your anger, do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. Okay? So again, is it don't, this is actually thought sometimes, in your anger do not sin. Some sees this as a quotation from Psalm 4:4. Actually, if you read it, I don't have it open here, but the Septuagint translation is closer to what this is. But again, it's, I remember in the King James it was like, be ye angry and sin not, for this particular text. But again, he's just saying, don't let your anger lead to sin. Okay. Now there's other verses dealing with anger, but again, this is not particularly an anger management verse. This is a sin verse. This is like, don't let your anger lead into sin. So recognize that being angry can lead that direction, can lead you to do things in the heat of the moment, so to speak, that you otherwise wouldn't have done. Okay. And so Paul is saying, listen, in this community of Jews and Gentiles, things are going to happen that are going to get you angry. They're not going to like the food you like, or they're not going to like the music that you like, or they're not going to like whatever. They might not like the right baseball team, or, any other heinous crime. Okay. And he's like, these things may make you angry, but don't let it lead to sin. Okay. Don't let it lead to sin. Don't let the sun go down. Don't go to bed. Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. Okay. Good advice. And there's a lot of, I know I've heard a lot of marriage kind of advice things that, if there's an issue, you need to deal with it. Don't let the sun go down upon your wrath, kind of thing. Good advice. Do not listen, and do not give the devil a foothold. Okay. Now that's an interesting concept that really you could put that on any of these particular prohibitions, that when you give into some particular sin, you give the devil a foot, you give him something. You give him something. I mean, I worked for a boss once who was notorious for his Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is this joy at the expense of others, joy at the pain of others. Okay, that if he had a story about you or experienced something about you that was at all remotely negative, he would bring it up over and over and over and over again. And I just remember I would talk to new people, that would come in, and I would say, hey, you got to remember this about this guy. He's, he lives for the misfortune of others. So you don't want to give him anything. Don't give him anything. So if you did something stupid, don't go to him and confess it, because he will hold it against you for the rest of your life. Okay. So again, this is this idea that, don't give him anything. Okay. Don't make it easy for him. Okay, the devil's, let's make the work of the devil as difficult for him as possible. Okay, let's not make it easy for him. Anyone who has been stealing, verse 28, anyone who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with their own hands, that they may have something to share with those in need. Okay, interesting verse here. It's like, okay, so you kind of wonder, so is the Christian church notorious for having a bunch of, retired thieves, and perhaps, again, I mean, the church is not made for perfect people. The church is made for broken people. But regardless, it's, again, with the stealing, it's kind of like, let's not give the devil a foothold. Let's not be, and stealing can be anything. And when we think of stealing, we think of the Great Brinks robbery, or we think of big, huge robberies or things that they make movies about. But it could be just stealing something small, stealing time, stealing materials from work, thinking, oh, nobody's going to notice, or it's part of my gig, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, these are all kind of things that you think you're getting away with it, and from a strictly punishment standpoint, you are, but chances are really, really good that somebody else knows about what you're doing. It's always kind of interesting when, if you've ever noticed that, periodically you'll read in the news that somebody will be caught in some crime, okay? Somebody will be caught in some crime, some financial shenanigans of some point. For example, like Bernie Madoff just died, okay? Bernie Madoff, who had been part of that Ponzi scheme here back a few years ago. And what's interesting is that as soon as somebody calls attention to these things that the people are doing, all of a sudden there's all these other people that go, oh yeah, well there's this and there's this and there's this. Yeah, he was doing this and he was doing this. Okay, so you think, oh, guess what I got away with? Well, you probably didn't. Somebody knows about it, and if somebody knows about it, they know that it's kind of, little off kind of stuff. What are you doing? You're just giving the devil a foothold there. Okay, so I think that's kind of one way that we can look at it today. Now, obviously, if you're a jewel thief, you need to stop. Okay, I'm just saying, but kind of think about what are some ways that perhaps we steal. Take things that don't belong to us. Okay, something to think about. But another interesting thing is, so there are people that are poor and or here it says they must work doing something useful. Why? So Paul talks about this. This is an interesting thing. He says, so you think, why do you need to work as opposed to steal? Why do you need to work? Well, to meet your needs and to supply your family? No, that's not what Paul says here. So that they may have something to share with those in need. It's kind of interesting that Paul here in the middle says, listen, you guys need to get out of being on the crime side or the receiving side, get into the producing side so that you can help those who are in need. Okay, so again, this is just another example. It's one of these constant themes through the Bible, and Paul just kind of sticks it in there. Our responsibility to the poor. Why do you need to work? Why do you need to obtain income or of some sort, whether it's money, obviously is good, or if you're a farmer and growing things, why? So you can share with those in need. Okay, so that people will see this. Again, talk about what we were talking about last week about some of the things we were mentioning then. Okay, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Okay. Again, not a lot of real deep analysis here, not any unwholesome talk. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, with whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Okay, this is kind of going back to what Jesus said in John chapter 14 about after he comes, he's going to give you the Comforter. He's going to bring to remembrance all this. And Paul talking about being called earlier in the first 3 chapters. And again, so this kind of as well as giving the devil a foothold, it grieves the Holy Spirit, with whom you were sealed. And of course, that limits your own effectiveness as a believer, as a witness, as somebody who is a Jesus follower. Then he just kind of drops like a list, okay? And again, get rid of all bitterness, rage, and anger, brawling, and slander, along with every form of malice. Okay? So, Paul's pretty clear here, and I'm not really going to go into a lot more here. He's not dealing necessarily with people of, specific people that he knows. We can't draw the conclusion that, oh, well, they had a lot of brawls at the church at Ephesus. No, he's just saying these are things that, and especially where might a brawl take place? Well, again, you've got 2 different distinct people groups coming together, and there's going to be differences of opinion over things. Okay, we keep harping on the what do you eat kind of stuff, but it's like, again, it could be any number of where you park your car, where you think you deserve to sit, where all of these things could lead to disagreements and all of this kind of stuff. Be kind and compassionate. So the opposite of this, it said, don't do this, do this. Okay, eliminate all of these: brawling, every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ and God forgave you. Okay, just as Christ forgave you. Forgiving. And again, the word here for forgiving, it's an ongoing thing. Okay, it's not like have a big moment of forgiveness and forget about it. It's like, no, remember that every day people are going to do things that bug you. Okay, if you're married, you know this. Okay, you know that every day you're married, your spouse, and I'm not saying that every day. This, it's not that bad, but very often, your spouse is going to do something, or your kids, or your parents. Or your brother or sister are going to do something that just bugs you for whatever reason, okay? And it's an ongoing thing, every day, ongoing, all the time, just as Christ forgave us. All the time, ongoing, forgive us. Snodgrass again points out a little later, he says, excellence is defined by business experts is doing a lot of little things well. Christians need to do a lot of little things well, keeping track, giving attention, and nurturing people. Doing a lot of little things well, okay? And, I read an article a couple weeks ago about written by a columnist who is not a believer, as far as I know. I mean, she may be, but she's not presenting herself as a believer. She's just a columnist for the Washington Post. Wrote a column about there's a congressman right now who's under some flack for various sundry crimes and misdemeanors against humanity. And one of the things that he is accused of doing or is alleged to have done is, he's kind of a ladies' man. I don't know if he's married or what, but he was kind of a ladies' man, and he liked to show pictures to fellow congressmen. Again, this is a great picture of the U.S. Congress. Show pictures of these women that he had slept with, and I don't know what stages of dress they were in or whatever, but he liked to go up and say, hey, look at this girl, look at this, I was with her, et cetera, look at her, that kind of stuff. Showing that, now this is a grown man, okay? This is not a teenager. I mean, this is a congressman, okay? So he's a college graduate. He's probably a law school graduate, okay? And he's sharing these things and with people. And this particular columnist said something I just thought was amazing. And she said that this was the time for people to say no, to just do this small, awkward no. And I just love that phrase, small, awkward no. Someday I'm going to create a whole sermon lesson based on that whole idea of a small, awkward no. Okay, just no. Doing a lot of little things well. And I think really when it comes down to it, I think what Snodgrass says here is really critical, that we want the big thing. We want a big program. We want a big moment. We want we want an Elijah on Mount Carmel moment all the time, okay? When in fact, most of the Christian life is just small, awkward no's, small, awkward yeses, just small things, keeping track of small things, keeping track of our neighbor, saying nice things, being helpful, leading, So, moving on. In fact, in verse 1 of chapter 5, as we move on, it says, follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children. It's kind of interesting as you look through the gospel stories, how many even of the stories that are picked, how many of the stories that that occurred to Jesus just happened as he was walking along. Okay, that he, sometimes he does things that are very particular. Okay, he went over here because I need to do this, but sometimes it's as he was walking along, this happened. Okay, I think the man born blind in John chapter 9, it's just as they were walking along, the two disciples said, hey, what about this guy? Okay, just as he was walking along, Jesus was just looking for these moments. So follow God's example, therefore, as dearly loved children, and walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Here in verse 2, he says, walk in the way of love. I haven't really made a point about this, but Paul in this passage, or actually in these two chapters, chapter 4 and 5, uses the same Greek verb. It's the Greek word that we get peripatetic from, the idea of wandering. Peripateo, I don't know what the actual Greek word is, but in verse 4:1, 4:7, 4:17, 5:2, and 5:8, he talks about these walk. Now sometimes it's translated live. In the King James, it was always translated walk. But this idea of this is how you walk. And walking as opposed to living has a different kind of little image. Kind of living we tend to think of when you say live your life. there's more of a passive element to it. Whereas walking, it's hard to passively walk. Okay, you have to take a step. Okay, and so the Greek word here is walk. Is that you are actively doing it, as opposed to living. It's like you can just sit and live and be alive. Where Paul is saying, live, walk. Okay, make these active steps. Be doing things. One step, little step. Okay, so I think there's probably a great message or series of messages coming out of Ephesians just based on these 4 walk passages. Maybe walking through Ephesians, kind of just an idea there. So walk in the way of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God. Okay, now beginning in verse 3 through 14, Paul is giving a series of things to avoid. Okay, now they're similar to what he's talking about, although we'll see kind of the difference just more in general. Okay, verse 3. So I'm in chapter 5, verse 3. But among you, there must not even be a hint of sexual immorality or any kind of impurity or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Again, we're back to the idea, that these are not deep. Okay, it's just you don't want a pastor who has a reputation as a ladies' man. Okay, you don't want a youth group leader who's a serious flirt. Okay, they're just not. You don't want a political leader who's showing pictures of women he slept with to fellow House members. Okay, you just shouldn't. You shouldn't be a hint, especially of people who name the name of Christ, who say, I am a Christ follower, or I am a member of that church, or I believe the Bible. Hey, let me show you about this. Let me tell you about this woman that was home with me last night. Okay, you see the there shouldn't even be a hint of sexual immorality, any kind of impurity, or of greed. Greed gets is interesting. I know we've got now ever since the late 1980s with Wall Street, we've got this, Gordon Gekko standing there going, greed is good. Okay, and kind of laying out the basis of our American capitalist system is fundamentally based on greed. I mean, I think we really need to come to grips with that our desire for something, we want more, to get more, that the whole capital is designed for greed. And it works really, really well for people who are really, really greedy. Okay? But greed is an interesting, because one commentator noted that greed is like the underlying basis of all sin. That we want something more than we should have. I mean, one person defined sin as wanting more out of life than God put into it, kind of thing. Okay, this idea of we just want more than we are entitled to, more than we should have. Okay, that's kind of greed. Okay, always wanting more, Okay, and Paul is like, don't let that be a part of you. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place. Okay, but rather thanksgiving. Interesting, the word here for coarse joking is the Greek word is eutrapelia. And outside of the New Testament, this is actually had a positive connotation to it. Okay, this kind of talk had a positive connotation to it. But I think perhaps maybe an English equivalent to this would be kind of like the snarky sort of, the left-handed comments, the sarcastic asides, or damning with faint praise. All of these sort of ways that, especially in the U.S. West, Paul is saying, that doesn't really build up the church. Rather, you should be thankful. Thanksgiving, being thankful, in Thessalonians, Paul says, in everything give thanks, for this is the will of God. 1 Thessalonians 5:18, I think. In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God. So rather you should be thankful. Which are out of place, but rather thanksgiving. For of this you can be sure, and this is the point that we've made before, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, that is, people who are actively practicing this, such a person is an idolater, no immoral, impure, or greedy person, such a person is an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. It's kind of interesting. It's like, so Paul says, like, look at this here. So immorality, impurity, greed, these are all idols. Because any person who is of this is an idolater, according to Paul. Okay, they're idolizing greed is stuff. They're obviously they're idolizing possessions, whether it's money or houses or stuff or people or that kind of thing. Okay, so no person doing this has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such thing God's wrath comes down on those who are disobedient. Okay, interesting thought here. Okay, so when we talked about it with John, I think it was, we kind of got into this whole idea that if a believer if there's a person who is a true believer and gets involved in some sort of sin, how long will God let it go on? Okay, and there's a couple. It's an interesting question, and there's again, it's a systematic theology thing. So you say somebody who is a believer, somebody who has the Holy Spirit indwelling them, according to 1 Corinthians, can they commit these sins? And if so, what happens to them? Okay, especially if they don't repent. Okay, see, I've known guys who were gung ho. I know one guy in particular. He was gung ho for God. He wanted to preach. He wanted to leave his job. He wanted to become a minister and a preacher in a small church. He wanted to evangelize. He wanted to do all of this stuff. He wanted to do it all. He wanted to go to graduate school, okay, to get a theology degree. He was, this was an older guy, again, he's 30s, older. He wanted to do all of this kind of stuff. Fast forward for a couple of years, he leaves his wife for a woman he met online, kind of thing. It's like, okay, wait a minute, what? How do you explain that? How do you explain that? How do you go into that? And again, this is a side note here, rabbit trail. I don't have a good answer for that, again, because again, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. You could say, well, perhaps the person was never a believer in the first place. Okay, that's one way. He or she was just acting the part. Okay, now that's completely possible. Now, my question always when I hear that is why? Why on earth would somebody play the part of being a gung-ho Christ follower? Just doesn't seem to me to be a fun idea. Of all the things I could pretend to be to get into with a group, that wouldn't be one of them. But hey, I'm strange. Okay, but maybe he or she was never a believer to begin with, or maybe the person lost their salvation. Okay, now again, we're getting into Calvinism versus Arminianism, and I don't, I lean more toward you can't lose your salvation, but it's not an issue I'm completely an expert on. Okay, or I guess a better way to put it is not that I'm fundamentally convinced. Okay, so this person can, maybe they lost their salvation, or maybe God at some point is going to bring them back, or maybe at some point God is going to, I don't know. Again, these are all possibilities, But what we do know, Paul is saying, is anybody who is doing this is not a member of the kingdom of God. Okay, so that's what we know, what Paul is telling people. And so maybe this point is this community is getting together, these Jews and these Gentiles, and they're doing great stuff, and they're having great barbecues and church picnics and the like. And somebody out there says, hey, I want to be a part of that as well. Sort of like in the book of Acts where Simeon tries to buy the Spirit, I want to do that too. Can I do that too? Okay. And Paul's saying, listen, these guys are not, and this is going to lead into our next passage, but he says, these guys are not necessarily members, okay, if they're habitually doing this. Let no one deceive you with empty words, because of such things God's wrath comes down on those who are disobedient. Therefore, do not be, what? Partners with them. And I think that's an interesting word, partners. Does this mean that if you know somebody, whether it's a family member, a neighbor, somebody you work with who fits all of these categories? He, coarse joking, foolish talk, obscenity, greedy, all of these. Does that mean you cannot associate with that person at all? No, it doesn't mean, because again, we're to be salt and light in the world, and going to get down to being light in a minute. But so, we should have a presence in this person's life, but it says don't be partners with them. Okay, again, Corinthians talks about being unequally yoked with an unbeliever. And we almost always equate that to a marriage situation. But I think it also equates with other kind of either business arrangements or partnerships or things like that. It's just be careful of what your interrelationships are, or what kind of alignments you're making with people who are not members of the body. It's really what it comes down to. For you were once darkness, verse 18. Okay, remember, do this, because for you were once darkness. Remember in chapter 4, verse 18. I'm going to read it to you real quick. Paul says, beginning verse 17, so I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They are darkened in their understanding. Okay, so now here Paul is saying, listen, you were once there. You were once darkness, but now you are light. Okay, you are light in the Lord. Live as children of the light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. Okay, so Paul is like, hey, you guys are children of the light. And again, we talked a lot about this. Light and darkness is a huge theme in 1 John. So you are children of the light. Be in the light, kind of thing. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth. And find out what pleases the Lord. Okay, find out what pleases the Lord. This is kind of a, wow. It's like, well, how does one do that? How do you find out what pleases the Lord? Well, here's an idea. Why don't you go to the book that the Lord has provided for you? And maybe there's some clues in there. Okay. Again, read the Bible, study the Bible, go, see what God has to say about himself. See how God reveals himself. Okay. Engage with the text, kind of like we're doing for this class, and see how you can find out more. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Okay. Again, this is that going back to that whole idea, that small, awkward no. That when somebody comes up to you and says, "Look, I'm not going to do this," or I don't want to see these pictures anymore. I know when I was there back in my previous career, we had this pattern where we could work over the weekends and we would get paid a certain amount of time for overtime. And so you could you would fill in a time card. You say, okay, I worked 12 hours. And this is one of the really controversial things, because on the one hand, people who on the ground who were actually doing the work would be traditionally upset because they thought they were working 14 hours and only getting paid for 12. And people above them thought they were paying for 12 hours and only getting 10. And in some cases, both of them were true, okay? But early in my career, it was far more common, the latter was far more common than later in my career, where it was just a given that every Saturday and Sunday you would tell the boss that you worked 12 hours. Whether you worked actually worked 12 hours or not. It was just you never really sat down. You just figured, okay, I'm going to get paid for 12 hours today. I'm going to do what I have to do, whether it takes me 8 hours or whether it takes me 12 hours, okay? That's what I was going to do, okay? And I wasn't in the job that long before I really realized, hey, this I can't really do this. I can't really go in and say that I worked something when I didn't actually work it. And so there was one particular time where I was with a group of others, and there were 5 or 6 of us, and it had to do with a job assignment that was in the Chicago area. So this group had flown in from California to help me, and I said. And so it was Saturday, and it was like 6 o'clock at the end of the day, and we were done. And these guys were talking about all that they were going to do that night. They wanted to go downtown to Chicago. They want to do this. They want to do this, right? And because then they could finish up tomorrow and all that kind of stuff. And I remember that was the first time that I said, "Look, guys, you just need to know this, that I personally am not putting down that I worked 12 hours today." Okay, and the thing about it is in order for this to really work, for this charade to work, everybody had to do the same amount. Everybody had to say, you had to stick together. Everybody had to kind of collectively get together on this and say, and I remember telling the group, I said, listen, I'm just want you guys to know, you guys do whatever you want as far as your time goes, your time cards go. I'm putting down what I actually worked, okay? And that's, no disrespect to whatever you want to do, but I'm not going to do anything different. I'm going to only put down what I worked. And of course, there was sort of like a dead silence in the group. And then all of a sudden, the tone of the group changed to, well, I guess we could get a flight home tonight. And I guess we could do this. So, and so did I make a big change? I don't know. It doesn't really matter to me. All I know is that I was comfortable. And from that point on, I was like, listen, this is what I worked. Okay. And I'm not going to play this game. Okay. Again, how do you expose? I'm not going to be a part of that. Does this mean that you have to shriek from the mountaintops? Does it mean that every time you see a friend in some sort of error that you need to post it on Facebook? No, of course not. Okay. But it's just saying, expose it. Just say the small, awkward no. I think if we just focused on the small, awkward no, we'd be in a much better place. Okay. It is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. Okay. So what is illuminated becomes a light, and you have been illuminated. Verse 14, this is why it is said, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Now, side note, this phrase, wake up, sleeper, rise from the dead, it's set off, if you have in your Bible, it's probably set off in a parentheses to kind of make it look like it's a quotation. And it might be. Some have looked at a couple of passages in Isaiah 26 and Isaiah 60. It's a little sketchy to think that it's not a quotation from either of these verses in particular. Now, some have thought that maybe this is a line from a hymn that was popular at the time, or maybe Paul is just making up a line that he, creating a poem right off the top of his head. I don't know. Okay. But it is some phrase or saying or song or passage that was familiar to the readers at the time that we're not really sure what it comes from. Okay. But wake up, sleepers, rise from the dead, Christ will shine on you. If Christ shines on you, you've been chosen and you have become a light. We talk about in earlier in verse 13. All right, finally, I just want to touch on the next two verses. And in fact, I'm going to come back and start on these two verses again. But finally, Paul says in verse 16 or 15, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Okay, now, if the days were evil in first century Rome, are they any less evil today? No, I don't think so. Okay, and I don't think anybody really believes that. Okay, so be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, making the most of every opportunity. Again, I think if we looked at making the most of, and again, we get that, the most, so it's got to be big. No, it doesn't have to be big. Okay, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to solve all the problems of the world. All you have to do is the small awkward no, or the small tap on the shoulder. Start with that. In Matthew 25, where Jesus is talking to when did we see you? And he says, whoever gives a glass of water to someone in my name, and the criterion that he uses is just a glass of water. That's it. Okay, it isn't that you rearrange their entire financial picture and straighten them out in life and got them into college and all of, and these are all great things, and if you can do them, that's great. Okay, but what Jesus is looking at is just a glass of water, small cup of water. Okay, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. All right. Well, next week when we come back, we're going to get into what's often referred to as the household codes. In Ephesians, end of chapter 4 and going into chapter 5. And I think we'll do that. And then after that, it's going to be Ephesians 6, which is the sword of the Spirit and all the breastplate of righteousness and all that kind of stuff. So I think we've got 2 more good weeks, maybe 3 in Ephesians. So thank you very much for being with me today. I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you again next week.